Almost every quilter that I know has made a Scrappy Trip around the world quilt. And that's because it is a gorgeous quilt pattern. It's also free, it's been around for over a decade at this point, and it uses a super clever piecing technique that makes the blocks come together very quickly. But, this is a big but, it's also true that a lot of my quilting friends have had a really grand old time making those quilt blocks, but then when we go to put them together, the seams don't nest like you think they should, despite having followed all the instructions that you found on whatever blog post you were reading. And that's super frustrating. Hi, I'm Shelly, I'm a long armor, I'm a quilter, and oh boy, do I love it when quilt seams nest on the back of my quilts. And I found it super frustrating every time I've made one of these quilts to have to like mash these seams in any which direction, making a dog's breakfast of the back of my quilt. That's why in today's video, I am super excited to share with you an easy pressing technique that I use on the back of my Scrappy Trip Around the World quilt blocks that ensures that I can put them up on my design wall or your design floor if that's what you have, and I can arrange them and rearrange them and they will all nest and fit together perfectly, I promise. Anybody that I've shown this hack to has told me that I need to share it immediately because it's a game changer for this quilt. And my goal with this video is that you'll be so excited about this pressing technique that you run out and start your next Scrappy Trip quilt. Or maybe your next 7. At the time I'm recording this, the Scrappy Trip Around the World quilt has been on a blog post since over 19 years. I think it was in 2005 that this thing came out on a blog post, which is like really ancient in terms of online blog post quilt patterns. That means that there's tons and tons of variations out there. The problem is that, given I'm such a rule follower, I carefully read blog posts and followed the directions on those blog posts. I made the blocks as I was told to. And then when I went to actually put them together, none of the seams locked together. None of them nested. So what is seam nesting and why am I so obsessed with it? Well, number one, it means that your seams are pressed in opposite directions. So that when you go to actually put those two pieces together, that little bit of patchwork, those seams are going to butt up against each other. And that does a couple things. Number one, if you're me, it means that you don't have to use pins because those seams are just going to lock in together and fit right the way that they're supposed to. And number two, it makes for a really flat quilt top. It really reduces the bulk by pressing in opposite directions so you don't end up with a big pile of fabric in one part of your seam. And I'm a long arm quilter, so you know that I love a nice flat quilt block and quilt top. So where did we go wrong? Why don't these nest? Because it looks like I'm looking at my Scrappy Trip Around the World quilt, which I have up on my design wall, which is right behind the camera. So I'm looking at it and they should go together. It's simple patchwork. Here's where the problem is. One of the very most popular blog posts has got a typo. So they tell you which two blocks to make, but one of the blocks was accidentally rotated 90 degrees. And that is an outcome destroying error. That means that if you follow that blog post and make all of those blocks, half of them are made wrong, and there's no chance that you will ever be able to nest your seams the way that you need to nest them. And if you're me, that means that when you go to put the quilt together, you end up with all these mashed seams going in any direction, which makes my heart hurt a little bit. So that's why, in this video, I'm gonna be sharing this technique with you, and it is tried and true, no fail, guaranteed 100% satisfaction guaranteed, or your money back. You know what I mean. It works really well. It's super fast, it's super easy, and it's going to guarantee that when you put your quilt blocks together, they're all just going to click together like little puzzle pieces coming into place. And if you've had problems with your Scrappy Trip Around the World quilt blocks in the past, this is going to, I promise, erase all the pain and hurt that you experienced before and make you feel so excited about making this quilt again. Let's talk about layout options because there's 1 million and you probably want to figure that out before you start making blocks. So first things first, we need to acknowledge that this came from Bonnie Hunter. So Bonnie K. Hunter is the quilting goddess and hero who came up with this tutorial over 19 years ago. And we have her to thank for this tutorial. Thank you, Bonnie. You're the best. I love you. Where would we be without this quilt pattern? And her original quilt pattern had you make one block, so just one type of block, and then you would rotate it in order to end up with a chain looking pattern that looks kind of like this. Quickly after the release of the pattern, people started to use the same fabric in the diagonal sections of their blocks, which led to an overall more cohesive look and a more defined chain throughout the quilt top. But see how these clumps of 4 fabrics appear when you use that single fabric throughout? That's not really my favorite look, which is why I was super pumped when I saw that Cindy from Hyacinth Quilt Designs came out with this alternate version which produces a more traditional looking chain. It's cute, right? Cindy's version uses a really clever design technique where she uses the exact same methodology to actually make the blocks, but instead of just making one block, she uses a 2-block design, block A, block B. And when you lay out blocks A and B in a checkerboard style on a quilt top, it produces this simplified chain. And I much prefer that look, and that's why I always make the 2-block version. But of course, within the 2-block version, there's still tons and tons of different ways that you could lay this out. So let's look at a couple. But I should say first that if you go on Instagram or social media and you look up any of the hashtags associated with this quilt, you will find tons of inspiration, way more than I could ever provide you in this video. So I would encourage you to go check out those hashtags, and I'll put those in the link in the description below. First, you could go completely scrappy and just lose your mind and just put any fabric next to any other fabric, which would result in a really scrappy, really fun looking quilt. Or you could use a little bit more structure and you can alternate light and dark fabrics. So you could either do that by just literally picking fabrics out of your stash and alternating light and dark, or you could use a background fabric for every other quilt block. You're going to produce a really different look if you use a light background fabric compared to if you use a dark background fabric. And I just find that so interesting to look at these two differences to see how different these two quilts look. If you want to add even more structure, you can add in what I'm going to call a hero fabric. And that hero fabric is going to be used throughout every single quilt block. And that means you're going to end up with a more defined, cohesive look because there's going to be one chain running through the entire quilt top. But of course, even if you choose to use a hero fabric, you still have lots of choices to make. You could use a print, you could use a solid, you could use a dark hero fabric, or you could use a light hero fabric. You could use a light hero fabric with a dark background fabric, etc., etc. There's just so many options that are available that I love how completely different this quilt pattern can look based on the fabrics that you choose. I'm currently working on a Scrappy Trip Around the World quilt, and the version that I'm making is using all Ruby Star Society fabrics. I had lots and lots of scraps, and I just cut up all kinds of strips to make this work. And I'm alternating light and dark fabrics by using a light background fabric, and then for my hero fabric, I'm choosing these bananas on hot pink fabric, which just makes me so happy. And it means that my quilt is going to end up looking something like this because I'm going really scrappy and I don't think I've repeated the same fabric twice, except for obviously the background and the hero print. It's going to look bananas, right? That's the goal. And if you were wondering how it is that I made all of those mock-ups, I used an online software called PREQUILT. I'll put a link to the description below in case you want to check out that software, but it's made by 2 lovely human beings who are in Canada, and they're a small business that I love to support. So how do you actually make these blocks? Well, it's super easy and really fun. First things first, it's strip based. So for this project, you're going to need strips on strips on strips on strips. Because for each and every quilt block you make, you're going to need 8 strips of fabric that are 2.5 inches wide by at least 21 inches long. And it doesn't really matter how long they are as long as they're 21 inches. For instance, this piece came off of yardage. I have yards and yards of this fabric in my stash. So I just cut off what I needed and then just cut the fabric in half, and I ended up with approximately 21 inches. And my 8 fabrics are comprised of 4 background strips, 1 hero print, and then 3 different random filler strips. And remember, your quilt does not have to look like this. You don't have to make it in this fashion. You could make it totally scrappy and it's still gonna look beautiful, so there's no wrong way to do this. But how you work with it is you take 2 of your strips, you put them on top of each other, and then you sew them together along this seam with a 1/4 inch seam, and then you press that seam towards the dark side. If your block doesn't have light dark fabrics, you simply need to press towards every second fabric. So if I was to number these fabrics 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, Then I would simply press towards every second fabric. So this seam would get pressed towards this fabric, this seam would get pressed towards this fabric, etc., etc. So it's a no-fail way. All you gotta do is just press towards every other quilt fabric. Once you've got your fabric sewn into pairs, you can put your pairs together. So I would flip them on top of each other, sew them together with a 1/4 inch seam. And then again, you're going to press towards the dark fabric or the even number fabric. So this would be fabric number 6. And then when you've got them into quads, you can sew them together until you end up with a strip set that is 21 inches wide and has 8 fabrics attached. This is where the genius of Bonnie Hunter's original design comes into play, because this next part is entirely her idea. So now that you've got your strip set, you're going to take fabric number 8 and bring it together with fabric number 1. So you're going to fold them together on top of each other, and you're going to stitch along this line a 1/4 inch seam. It seems weird, but you just have to trust the process. The next step in the gotta see it to believe it process involved in making the Scrappy Trip around the world blocks is to then cut this tube that you've just made, because it's essentially, you know, a tube, is to cut this into 2.5 inch wide strips. And to do this, I'm gonna use my trusty Stripology ruler. This thing has been through some stuff with me. I've dropped it, I've broken it. It's still working hard. And it's a slotted trimming tool, which just makes this kind of work really easy. I'm going to align one of the horizontal lines along the top of my strip set. And I'm going to, you probably can't see it on camera, but there's a white line that I'm aligning with the bottom of my strip set. And then I'm going to shift it horizontally so that the 0 mark is still catching all the edges of the strip set that I have. And the 20 inch mark is also on the, like I don't want it to be off the edge of the strip set. So I'm just gonna align that nicely. Everything looks good and square. And now I'm going to take out my rotary cutter and I'm going to cut every 2.5 inches. And for dummies like me, well, I'm no dummy, but you know what I mean? I like it when things make it easy for me. The Stripology ruler has got little squares along the bottom of the ruler that show you where to cut if you want to be cutting 2.5 inches at a time. The stars tell you where to cut if you want to cut every 1.5 inches. So I'm just going to follow the squares along the bottom, and I'm going to cut this into 2.5 inch wide strips. So I'm not thinking too hard about it. I'm just following the squares. Next square is here at 10 inches. Next square is at 12.5. Next square is at 15 inches, 17.5. And then my last cut is at 20 inches. So if I remove my Stripology ruler, and you know I'll put a link for it in the description below just in case it's going to be life-changing for you. Oh, I didn't quite cut that one all the way. But okay, flip that one right around. I was going to say, whatever you do, don't move these. Just leave them exactly the way they are, and then you can discard these cute little bracelets of fabric. I've got my trusty seam ripper. I've got more room ahead of me. And the next part in this, why didn't I think of that process, is to start unpicking some of these rows. So you've got 8 strip sets set out in front of you, and each strip set has got 8 fabrics in it. So I like to think of this as strip set number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And in order to keep this very organized, and so I don't get confused, I think of this top seam as seam number 1, and this seam as seam number 2. This is seam 3, this is seam 4, seam 5, etc. So if I'm picking up strip set number 1, I'm going to unpick, yes, for real, even though you just, sewed some seams in this, I'm going to unpick seam number 1, and then I'm going to pull it open. Oh my gosh, it already looks cute. It already looks so cute. Okay, so strip set 1, I unpicked seam 1. This is strip set 2, so I'm going to unpick seam number 2. And I really like this clover seam ripper because it just fits really well in my hand, I find. So same thing, I'm going to pull that open and lay it flat. Pick up this is strip set number 3, so I'm unpicking seam number 3. And I find that when I do it this way, I don't get confused, and I'm not trying to strategically unpick anything first. I'm just literally picking up number 3 and unpicking number 3. This is number 4, so I'm going to unpick 1, 2, 3, 4, this seam right here. And there's something so satisfying about this because Bonnie's technique means that it produces different results in all of the strip sets that you unpick without having to sew all of these squares individually. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is this one. My gosh, this fabric has eggs on it. Are you kidding me? Ruby Star Society, what are you guys even doing over there? Okay, now this is number 6. So I'm gonna pick up, this is seam number 5. So if I flip that over, this is seam number 6. And just lay it flat. This will be 6, 7. And this way I find I have the least amount of errors. Not to say that I have never had to re-sew and re-pick, because I have. Okay, so again, this is our last one. So I'm going to unpick seam 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this is the last one. And then you'll see that every one of these strips has got a completely different layout on it. But I'm not quite done with these because you see how this strip set right here is not quite pressed. So I'm going to get out my pressing mat and I'm going to press every one of them. So again, I'm not going to move anything around. I'm just going to pick them up, and wherever I see that seam needs to be pressed, because most of them are laying flat, but this one is not. So I'm going to press it towards the dark fabric. And then usually at the top or at the bottom, there's this weird little bumpy piece where, you know, I unpicked it, so I was not very happy about that. Oh, iron's ready. So I'm just going to press that flat, and I'm going to do that for every one of these strip sets and just put them back where I found them. No need to rock the boat. And this step doesn't take very long, but I do find that it gives me much better results if I take the time to press these seams. Because then when I actually go to sew these together, they're going to sit a lot flatter. Now I've got my strip sets nice and flat, which means that they're going to go together perfectly in the next step where I show you how to actually make these blocks. Oh my gosh, it already looks pretty, but from here, the next thing we need to do is play the matching game in order to carefully recreate either block A or block B. And let's start with block A because it's just maybe a little bit more simple. As you see with block A, the hero print goes from the top left-hand corner of the block down to the right-hand bottom corner of the block. And so you might be looking at this and thinking, holy moly, Shelly, you're really close. All you have to do is just move this little strip set over here, and then bingo bango, that is block A. Am I right? I am right, and so are you. So bonus points for that. But this isn't going to work for me. It's because of these eggs. It's actually not because of these eggs. Okay, but here, I'll use them as an example. These eggs, if you look really carefully, they are a directional print. And I think of eggs as going like this, facing up and down. So if I sewed this block together, just like this, with all these columns exactly like this, my eggs would be sideways, which honestly, honestly don't care about these eggs being sideways, but I do have other blocks in this quilt that I'm working on that have got text written on them. And the text is not aligned like this, the text is aligned like these eggs. So in order for the text to appear upright, I needed to sew my block together not in columns, but instead in rows. And that can be accomplished very easily. All I have to do is find the one where the eggs are going upright and the hero print is in the top left-hand corner, and that's this one. And then I would grab the one where it's one step down from that and one step down from that. And then I'm just gonna keep on going. So I'll move my little cup of tea out of the way. And the thing to note about this is that I am now constructing this block in rows rather than in columns. And in truth, my brain would prefer to do it in columns, but these dang directional prints are not going to let me do it. And since I made one block, no matter which way you do it, you have to do it the same way, is what I'm trying to say. So if you make one of your blocks in rows, you've got to make all of the blocks in rows like this. You can't make some of them in rows and some of them in columns, because if you do that, those seams are not going to match. They're not going to match. Ask me how I know. Ask me how much unpicking I had to do to figure that out. So whatever you decide for your first block, you have to do for every single block of your construction method. Stick with one construction method. So me, I'm doing it in rows, even though my brain wants to think in columns. So how do I now organize this and get it sewn together so I don't miss anything or like mix up the order? Well, I'm gonna look at it in the way that I would actually sew it together. So I'm gonna rotate this whole thing. I'm gonna place a clip in the top left hand, the top of the most left-hand corner, because I'm doing it like this because this is how I sew. So you sew like this. I'm going to fold this one on top of this one, and then I'm going to have to sew these two together. And then I'm going to place these on top of each other so that I can take this whole thing to my sewing machine. And I know that this is the top left-hand block. I will sew a 1/4 inch seam down here. I will open that up. Then I will take the next block or the next strip set. I'll place that on top. I will sew a 1/4 inch seam, press it open, take the next one, etc. So this is not the most efficient because it does not involve any sort of strip piecing, but this is the way that I can do it so that it makes the most sense in my brain, and it means that I will not mix up the order. So I'm going to take these to my sewing machine, sew them all together, and then show you how cute that looks at this next stage. One thing about this is that already my seam nesting is starting to pay off, because when I go to sew this strip set to the existing one, these seams are all going to nest so nicely because I pressed in opposite directions. So that's a big plus. I'm also not going to use pins when I do this because that's just how I do. And I'm sewing them together with a 1/4 inch seam. I can simply feel that they're nesting together. And then ta-da, those seams match up beautifully, no pins, super easy peasy. Now all of the strip sets are sewn together and I have a block. It's not pressed yet, but I mean, we're almost there. Next thing I'm gonna do is take off this clip because now at this point it's fake news. This was trying to tell me it was in the top left-hand corner, but in fact, you and I both know that the top left-hand corner of this block would have my hero print in it because block A has the hero print running diagonally from top left to bottom right. I could also have it go like this because it's same thing, top left, bottom right. But if I had directional fabric that was very clearly facing one way, like for instance, all these eggs, I can see you're actually facing up this way. And if you had writing on your fabric, you would want to make, you could only really use it one way or the other. One way or the other, not both. So we're very, very nearly done with this. We just have to press it. And I'm going to show you that technique in this next section. Here comes the magic. If you swirl the seams on the back of your quilt blocks, you will be able to place your Scrappy Trip around the quilt blocks anywhere on your design wall, and it will nest perfectly with the block next to it. So block A's go to next to block B's, and block B's are on top of block A's, etc. But if you do this to all of your quilt blocks, they are going to nest perfectly, guaranteed. And the best part about this is that as you finish your quilt blocks, you can press them immediately. You don't have to lay out your whole quilt top and then decide where everything goes and then start pressing them. You can press them immediately as you finish them. And this is a big difference between what I've seen in the other tutorials versus this kind of hack that I figured out because I was like, why doesn't it fit? It has to fit. It should fit. So if you do this, they will fit. So what do I mean by swirling your quilt seams? Well, first of all, it's a term that you may have heard somebody else say, twirling or fanning or whatever. There's lots of different terminology, but it produces a pinwheel looking design on the back of your quilt at each of the seam intersections. And bonus, not only is it cute and it'll make you feel like a quilting ninja, it actually produces a much flatter quilt top. As a long arm quilter, you know that I want a flat quilt top because a flat quilt top quilts up much better than a lumpy one. So not only is this practical, it's also cute and you're gonna feel really good when you do it. To swirl your quilt seams, you need to flip your block so that it is right side facing down. Yep, that's the way we're gonna say that. And you want to have the seams that you just sewed running horizontally. And we could start at any intersection anywhere on this block, but let's start at this one because I think with the bright fabrics, you'll be able to see it on the camera. So take a look at this intersection right here. You'll notice that this seam is traveling left to right, and this seam over here is traveling right to left. And that's great news because if you want to swirl your quilt seams, you need all of the seams at any given intersection to be traveling in the same direction, either clockwise or counterclockwise. So we're off to a good start, and that's why we pressed things towards the dark side or towards every other block, so that we can now manipulate these two seams in order to follow this pattern. So if we were following this pattern, this seam needs to go down and this seam needs to go up. And when you push them in that direction, especially at the quilt intersection, you're going to feel, or maybe hear, a couple of little stitches pop in this intersection. And those stitches are the stitches that were right here. So we previously sewed them, and then you stitched across with this seam right here. So when you pop open a stitch or two, these are safe. You're not gonna develop a hole in your quilt top if you swirl your quilt seams because this line of stitching is protecting those two stitches that we just popped. Popping just means that they kind of released. So when you do that, it fans open and now you see that little pinwheel design. So that's this intersection. Then I'll move over to this intersection. And this one's going the opposite direction. So this seam needs to go up. Great, it needed to go up over here too. And it needs to go down on this side. And I'm just going to continue along this path and I'm just going to pop those a couple seams at a time until I've got a whole row done and popped. Then I'm going to grab my iron, and I like to start with a dry iron, so no steam, I just turn the steam on. So I like to turn the steam off, and I'm just going to lift up my iron and place it at each intersection, making sure that I'm getting the fabric going in the direction that I want it to be going in. So I'm not dragging my iron across the quilt top, I'm lifting it just as all of our quilty godmothers told us we should do. And once I've gone over it once and I feel like, okay, yeah, that's the way I want it to be, I'll turn the steam back on and then I'll hit it with some steam so that I get a really flat seam on the front. So that's all there is to swirling your seams. And I don't know if you can tell, but this is so flat and not lumpy at all, which is really nice to see in a quilt top. So normally what I do is I do all the popping, pop, 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 pop. And I do that the whole block, and then I'll do the pressing, press, 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 press. So instead of doing one row at a time, I'll pop them all and then I'll press them all. But I just wanted to show you that. Isn't that so cute? Like, isn't that such a fun trick to learn? And for some reason, I don't know why, but it seems more complicated than it is. But the key is that you really do have to start with these rows being pressed towards every other block. And that's why it works perfectly with this quilt pattern. So now I'm gonna finish up and press all the rest of these seams. I'm gonna pop them and then press them, pop and press to get my swirled seams. So now I've got my A block that is finished, and the construction method for block B is exactly the same, but you can see that they are physically two different blocks. So here we've got the hero fabric going from top left to bottom right, and in this block, the pattern starts in the second row up and travels up, and then you have one little hero print in the corner. So you do exactly the same thing, you just do a different matching game to make this pattern instead of this one. And the joy with swirling the seams is that now any A block and any B block, when they come together, are going to nest perfectly because all of these seams alternate directions. So for instance, at this intersection right here, this seam is traveling down and this seam is traveling up. So that intersection would nest perfectly. Those two are going in opposite directions, opposite, 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 opposite. So that's great side by side, but even top to bottom, they're going to match as well. So these ones are all going to be alternating towards the dark fabric because I put mine together in rows. But anyways, all that to say, they're going to match perfectly. So you can make your A blocks and B blocks and then just position them and reposition them as much as you like. And when it comes time to actually sew the quilt together, there's going to be no mashed seams, no tears of sadness, no confusion, wondering where you went wrong. It's all just going to work perfectly. Who knew it could be that simple? Isn't that such a neat trick? I think it's amazing that one small change in the pressing directions can make a world of no pun intended, can make a world of difference in the outcome of your scrappy trip around the world quilt. My hope is that you watched this tutorial and you got so excited that you already started working on your next scrappy trip project. And if you're looking for an iron that's going to help you get those super flat quilt blocks, I can highly recommend the Reliable Corporation brand of irons. They gave me 2 different irons to test out and I put them through their paces and I shared all of my findings about the difference between the 2 of them, including the reason that I chose to keep this red one instead of the big fancy blue one that they gave me in this video right here. So if you're in the market for a high quality iron, you'll definitely want to check out that comparison video. As always, I'm wishing you happy scrappy quilting and I will see you in my next video.